Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een, amma ba'd. So, today we're going to be covering a topic which has to do with the revealed attributes of Allah. Now we've already covered the attributes of Allah, but now we're covering what are called the revealed attributes of Allah. Well, what's the difference? All the attributes of Allah are revealed. But this is a specific category which are known as as-sifat, which means attributes, al-khabariyah, meaning they come directly from textual sources only. Now there's a difference between the directly revealed, meaning textual attributes of Allah, and the attributes of Allah which we can kind of comprehend on a rational grounds. So for example, we've already covered that Allah is the most knowledgeable. He's the most wise. He's the all-powerful. He's the most merciful. He's the creator. He's what else? What else did we cover? What are the attributes of Allah that we talk about? He's one. What else? He's the just. Exactly, He's the just. What else?
He's the wise.
The wise. I said that. He's the first and He's the last, right? Yes. He's infinite. We didn't cover that in detail. Yeah. It kind of goes in with justice and power. He's eternal. Yes, He's eternal. Mercy. Yeah, I said that too. No? I said that one already. Yeah, I said that. So we covered all these, right? Now these are kind of abstract attributes of Allah, right? Abstract in the sense that you can't picture them, right? They're like characteristics which are qualities that belong to Him. Quality of power, quality of knowledge, the quality of being the first, being the last. So now we're going to be covering something which are known as the revealed attributes of Allah, and we're going to see a difference of opinion among scholars. Difference of opinion among scholars regarding them. Okay? This is a topic which we're going to be covering, and people have reflected a long time on it, since for a very long period of time. So let us understand properly what does it mean. As soon as we get into it, you're going to understand exactly what I mean. So there are verses in the Quran and there are prophetic statements which on the surface seem to be comparing Allah with some aspect of creation. On the surface. That's what they may appear to be. But the question is, in reality, can you compare Allah with anything in creation? No, we've already made that very clear, right? You cannot do that. So when we look at these verses and we look at these statements or these prophetic narrations, we cannot say that the attributes of Allah or Allah is being compared with the creation in any way. Right? No one can ever say that. You cannot compare Allah with the creation in any way, shape or form, right? We made that clear. But the question is, when we see something that somewhat appears to be doing that, how are we supposed to interpret that verse of the Quran? And how are we supposed to interpret that prophetic narration? That's exactly what the topic of this is. And I was debating whether or not we should even get into this. Since we're almost at the end of class, this is kind of like a higher level discussion. This, in reality, has less to do with affecting your life in a practical way than it does understanding and avoiding debates and discussions on this type of issue. So let's go through some examples. Now this text, if you've noticed, this text was a translation of a book by a scholar named, who read? Hassan al-Banna, right? So Imam Hassan al-Banna was an Egyptian. Some people say he was Kurdish, but he lived in Egypt, and he's well known now because you hear in the media all the time, Muslim Brotherhood. He's the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, right? But his book that was written on belief or faith is really an amazing book. And in fact, it's a book that I did my thesis on. I translated the book for my thesis in seminary with commentary as well. Never been published. But he only finished 1/4 of his book. And he was in Palestine, and he was was engaging in jihad, and on his way back, he was shot and he was killed. So he became, a martyr, inshallah. So he didn't finish his book, but he has a very important discussion and a very, very insightful thoughts on this subject, which has become such a contentious subject, because one of the things that he made his mission to do is to try to unite Muslims as much as possible, particularly in the time in which he was living, 30s, 40s, around that area. So I thought it's important, first of all, that you realize this is not 100% my own work. I've translated it, but this is his work. So we're going to be going through his section on this, and it's a very, very important section, I think. Some of you may think that, why are we even discussing this in the first place? This is not relevant. I would have never asked these questions, if you didn't bring up these questions. And I agree with you 100%. So for those of you who have that, totally apologize. I wish you had not had to deal with this. And in an ideal society, it would have been better that you don't even look at this issue at all. But in reality, this is a topic which literally divides Muslims. Divides them to such an extent that people don't even want to talk to each other. It can get that bad. It can get to a point where people divide themselves among groups, such that they don't recognize the other people as being even close to being on the right path. They call them Muslim, but very, very far from Islam. So that's why it's such an important topic to address and to try to bring some unity and harmony among the two different opinions. And that's what we're going to be doing, and we're going to be looking at 4 opinions on this issue, 2 of which are acceptable and 2 of which are wrong. Okay, so like he says, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us success in expounding the truth, and we ask Allah to guide us to what is correct. So let's take a look. What are we talking about? The revealed attributes of Allah. Here are some examples from verses of the Quran. Allah says, in translation, everyone on earth will perish. All that will remain is the face of your Lord, full of majesty, bestowing honor. Okay. So has anyone recently come across this verse? So what's the question here? This verse refers to all that will remain is the face of your Lord. Okay, so the thing is, a face is usually associated with something in creation. Whether it's a human being or whether it's an animal or whether it's whatever it may be. So the thing is, how do we understand that? There's many verses which refer to the face of Allah. What does it mean? Is it literal? Should the word be taken literally, or should it be understood in a different light? Other verses. Indeed, we showed you favor before. We inspired your mother, saying, put your child into the chest, then place him in the river. Which story are we talking about? Prophet Musa. Let the river wash him onto its bank, and he will be taken in by an enemy of mine and his. I showered you with my love and planned that you should be reared under my watchful eye. So now the word eye is used. So the question is, what does that mean and how do we understand it? It was revealed to Noah, none of your people will build other than those who have already done so. So do not be distressed by what they do. Build the ark under our watchful eyes and with our inspiration. So now you have the word eye and in the plural as well. So what does that mean and how do we understand it? There are other verses in the Quran which speak about a hand. So it says, I'm going to summarize this, are actually pledging loyalty to God Himself. God's hand is placed on theirs, and anyone who breaks his pledge does so to his own detriment. It's referring to a hand. The Jews have said God is tight-fisted, but it is they who are tight-fisted, and they are rejected for what they have said. Truly, Allah's hands are open wide. He gives as He pleases. Next verse, can they not see how among the things made by our hands we have created livestock that they control? So we're talking about hands. Then there are other verses which mention other words in reference to Allah. Allah warns you to beware of Himself. The final return is to Allah. So some of you may not get this part, but the word Himself is, nafsi. So the word nafs was used in connection with Allah. Nafs can mean either soul or spirit, or it can be a reflexive pronoun referring back to somebody. So now the question is, how do we understand that the word nafs was used in association with Allah? Similar in another verse, you know all that is within me, though I do not know what is within yourself. Nafsik. You alone have full knowledge of things unseen. So we have these words being used for Allah. Another verse, the Lord of mercy established on the throne. So establishing on a throne is the act of what a king would do, right? A king usually, sets themselves up on a throne in order to, display the majesty, in front of all of these people. Next verse, He is the supreme master over His subjects. Over indicates space, right? Another verse, are you sure that He who is in heaven will not make the earth swallow you up with a violent shudder? In heaven meaning space, spatial reference. Good words rise up to Him and He lifts up the righteous deed. Spatial again. Okay? So these are all things which are being associated with Allah in some way, shape or form. The last category are those things which people felt are only human-like attributes, and Allah is being described by those attributes. So for example, those who insult Allah and His Messenger will be rejected by Allah in this world and the next. So being rejected is something we've discussed already, but that's seen as like a human type attribute. And Mary, the daughter of Imran, she guarded her chastity, so we breathed into her from our spirit. So breathing is being connected or associated somehow with Allah. So how do we understand that? And then another verse, when your Lord comes with the angels, rank upon rank. So coming implies a state of motion from one place to another place or whatever it may be. So now we've seen there are verses in the Quran which some people, or perhaps many people, would feel a sense of confusion and say, that seems to me like it's comparing Allah with something in creation, and that's something that we're not supposed to do in the first place. Are we at least following up until now? We're following the point? Okay, so then we have prophetic statements or hadiths which mention similar things. So in addition to the verses of the Quran, you have certain ahadith or hadiths. For example, the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, this will happen, referring to the hellfire. People will continue to be thrown into hell, and it will say, are there any more? This will happen until the Lord puts His foot over it. So now the word foot has been used. Another one is, Allah is more delighted when one of you repents than when you find your lost riding animal in the desert. So some people have said the act of being delighted or the act of being happy is an emotional trait. And emotional traits are characteristic of creation. So how do we understand that? And how do we understand how could that be applied to Allah in any way, shape or form? So now that we understand the issue, we have to determine, is it a problem or is it not a problem? And what should we do about it? All right? So before we begin, how many of you think that this is actually an issue? That's an important issue that needs to be resolved. Okay. How many of you before I read these things to you had a question like this in your mind beforehand? From before. Okay. How many of you are hearing this for the first time in your life? Just be honest, for the first time ever. No, not the debate, like this, like this type of thinking, this way of thinking. First time in your life. Few people, or they're all gone? Yeah, few people. First time in your life. All right. And from those, how many of you are like getting a little confused now? Hopefully. No, we're still clear, hopefully, inshallah. Okay. Inshallah, by the time we finish this class, inshallah, you're going to be clear. So don't worry. As long as you don't leave early, you're going to be okay. And if you leave early, may Allah help you. Inshallah. Alright. There are 4 opinions on this issue. Muslim scholars have taken 4 different opinions on this issue. The first group, they took everything that we've mentioned so far, the foot, the hand, the smiling, the anger, the attribute of being in a particular space, according to the literal meaning. 100% according to the literal meaning. So they said that Allah has a face. like the face of creation. So it doesn't look like a face, but it's just like a human has a face, Allah has a face just like a human has a face. Or an animal has a face, Allah has a face as well. Allah has a hand like the hands, somewhat similar to something in creation. So what has a hand? Human beings have hands. Who else has hands? Animals have hands. Other things have hands. So Allah has a hand like the hands of creation, but superior. Some kind of, X-Men comic book or whatever it is. Laughter like their laughter. So Allah's laughter is similar to the laughter of creation. So when you think that Allah is laughing about something, and there's certain prophetic statements which talk about Allah laughs when this thing happens. So they imagine in their minds that the laughter is similar to the laughter when we laugh. They're imagining those sounds. You understand? Okay, etc. So much so that some of them even claimed that Allah is old, meaning He has a long, range, while others claim that Allah is young. So they took it to that extent. This is known as anthropomorphism. Okay, what's known as anthropomorphism, tashbih. Okay, in Arabic, and this Imam Banna says has nothing to do with Islam. This has absolutely nothing to do with Islam, and there's nothing in these statements which has any validity, and it is sufficient to mention the statements of Allah, which we've discussed. There is nothing like Him. He is the all-hearing, the all-seeing. So when the Quran says, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ, there is nothing at all like Allah, then this opinion is 100% negated and it's completely wrong. It's a wrong understanding. And also, Surah Al-Ikhlas, say He is God the One, God the Eternal. He begot no one, nor was He begotten. No one is comparable to Him. So we've addressed this point already. This group is 100% wrong. Okay, clearly in the wrong. There's a second group. And the second group, they reacted to the first group. So you have to understand reaction, because of someone's position. So they saw this first group and they said, look, what in the world are they thinking? How could they associate Allah with some type of creation like that? We need to go and protect Islam from this. So they went to the opposite extreme. And the opposite extreme said what? This group, they said, we nullify the meanings of these words in their totality. Meaning all these words, face, hand, foot, laughing, smiling, all of those things we just mentioned, these words do not have any of those meanings whatsoever. They don't have any meaning here. And what they were trying to do was, they were trying to remove any association that these words could have with Allah. So what did they do? They said, according to them, Allah does not speak. Because speech is the attribute of something in creation. Therefore Allah cannot speak, Allah cannot hear, Allah cannot see. Because the only way you can speak, hear or see is through the possession of body parts. This is their understanding. To the possession of body parts, and something you can never attribute a body part to Allah. Therefore, Allah does not have any of these attributes either. We deny all of that, including sight and hearing and speech and everything else. Anything that closely comes to even relating closely to creation, we have to say that Allah does not do any of those things. Okay? So we should never use the terms like the Quran is the word of God, for example. Because the word of God that implies speech, don't ever say that. Because speech is a characteristic of a human being, because he has to emit sound waves, and sound waves and all of that only comes through, body parts and all of that stuff. So they nullified the attributes of Allah. This is called nullifying the attributes of Allah, removing them, and they assume that this is a way of glorifying Allah and saying that He's above all of this anthropomorphism that people are ascribing Him to. So you see two extreme reactions. One of them is anthropomorphism, and the other one is what scholars call nullification of the attributes of Allah. Okay? And they deny basically Allah of almost all His attributes. The scholars of the history of theology, they gave this group the name Jahmiyyah, in addition to other names. Because one of their leaders, his name was Jahm ibn Safwan. But we're going to cover that more in detail next week. So I'm going to read this statement verbatim for you. Imam al-Banna, he says, I don't think that anyone with a little intellect would swallow such a ridiculous statement. It's his wording. Right? How can Allah be denied the attribute of speech when it's confirmed that speech, hearing, and sight have been attributed to some creatures which don't possess body parts? So see, this is a very interesting argument that no one has really made too much in the past, because Imam al-Banna lives in the 20th century. So he understands that now we've come to learn that there are other creatures which are communicating, and we say that they're speaking, for example, but they're speaking in a way which no one ever thought in the past. But it's not what we generally describe as speech. So for example, what would be one type of creation which we say kind of communicates or speaks, but no one in the past would have imagined that they have this kind of communication? Huh? Texting. Okay, texting, yeah, that's okay. Texting is a form of communication. What else? Anyone else? Plants? Okay, plants are speaking. Right. Okay, what else? Dolphins. Right, what do they use? Sonar. Right? Dolphins use sonar. No, but that's in the past. People knew that. What is something that kind of new? So dolphins, bats. Right? You're going to say bats? Yeah, bats. Things like that. So now they're considered speaking as well. They have a way of communicating. So do we associate speech only with those certain kind of body parts, or like with just sound waves only? No, not necessarily. So he's saying things differ, and we have a better understanding. We should have a better understanding based upon our knowledge of the world. So he's saying Allah is far above what they claim. These are two false opinions which should not be taken seriously. So these are the two extreme opinions which fall outside of the realm of acceptability. But he says there are two more opinions, and these two opinions are the opinion of what are known generally as the Salaf, or the early generation of Muslims, and the Khalaf, the later generation of Muslims, the latter generation. So the difference between Salaf and Khalaf, the word Salaf means people who preceded. It's referring to the earliest group of Muslims. Either it could refer to the companions, or the companions and their followers, or the companions and the two generations that came after them. Generally, Salaf falls somewhere within that category. And the Khalaf literally means the latter generation of Muslims, the ones who came after them. Okay, so we're going to clarify that what we call the position of the Salaf is not really the position of the Salaf in reality. It's just termed that way, but we're going to go through a little bit more detail. Okay, so as for the first group of people, okay, what did they say? How are they understanding these attributes? And what are they saying about these verses? What are they saying about these prophetic narrations? It says, we believe in these verses and traditions as they are. Okay, we believe in them as they are. So that's similar to the first group up until now, right? And we abandon investigating the intended meaning attributed to Allah. So we don't investigate the meaning, the underlying meaning of what this is supposed to mean. So what are they saying basically? They're saying, whatever word was used, we believe in that word, but we don't investigate what it's really supposed to mean. So their explanation is, we affirm the attributes of hand, we affirm the attributes of eye, of eyes, of establishment on the throne, of laughter, of surprise, all of that. All of these things are attributes of Allah, and we affirm them, but we don't go into details. And what we say instead is, all of that was mentioned in the Quran and the Hadith, it's according to the meanings which can never be fully comprehended by human beings. Therefore, we leave to Allah the full understanding of these things. So somebody says, hey, this hand and Allah, how can that be? Doesn't make sense to me. He says, look, you believe in this word, you know it's in the Quran, you know what it means, but don't start asking questions about it, and don't start making associations about it and all of that. Don't focus on any of that. You should keep your mind occupied with other things. So we leave the details to Allah. You don't need to know the details of this meaning, especially since we've been ordered not to think about these type of things, because this is hadith, the Prophet peace be upon him said, think about the creation of Allah, don't think about Allah himself, because you will not be able to grasp His true reality. So you should not be focusing on what does Allah look like, or what is Allah, where does He exist, or what is this. All these details that's not going to benefit you at all. So why are you wasting your time thinking about that? You believe in the verse, reflect on the creation, the things that Allah has created, and just go on with your life. Don't waste time thinking about all of these things. Okay? So you have several scholars taking this position throughout history. So some of them, I'll give you some examples. Abul Qasim al-Lalikai, he said in one of his books, which is one of the students of Imam Abu Hanifa, he said all of the jurists, all of the fuqaha, Islamic law scholars in the East and the West, they agreed upon belief in what is in the Quran and the Hadith. You have to believe in everything in the Quran. You have to believe in all the Hadith, which have been authentically attributed to the Prophet, regarding the attributes of Allah without any interpretation, without any description, or without any comparison. So what they're saying is this is an attribute of Allah that's been mentioned by Allah. You believe in it, but you don't try to give an interpretation to it. So all these words that we just talked about, what they're basically saying is you shouldn't even have a discussion about it in the first place. Which is what we're doing though. But we're going to do that anyways for the sake of this discussion here. But they're saying don't get involved in the details. Don't start thinking and asking questions. Well, this seems to resemble. Don't ask that question. Get that question out of your mind and start focusing on other things. Understanding so far what their position is? Okay. So then he says, today whoever interprets any of that has gone against the Prophet and the Muslim community. So he says, whoever goes and tries to give some detailed interpretation of what that is, they've gone against what the Prophet actually taught, and they've gone against the Muslim community because they neither described nor interpreted, but they rather quoted what is in the Quran and the Sunnah, and they remain silent. So he says, go and look at the earliest Muslims. You don't see them talking about these issues in detail. You don't see them going and say, well, what does this mean? And what does that mean? And could this mean this? Does this resemble Allah somehow? Does He have body parts? Does He communicate this way? You don't have them saying that. Instead, they used to quote verses of the Quran, explain another point, but they wouldn't explain the details of this point. This is the first position. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal is one of the major figures of this school. And he's considered to be pretty much like the founder of this school. Okay, why is he the founder of this school when so many Muslims have lived before him? Who is Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal? He's one of the 4 famous imams who codified Islamic law. So many of you have heard of the 4 imams who are famous and they codify Islamic law. He's the 4th among them. He's the last among them. In terms of when he lived, he was the latest. Okay, he was a contemporary of Imam Bukhari, older than him. Imam Bukhari was like one of his students, a little bit younger. So he's around that time. So he's one of the pioneers of this school. Okay, how can he be the pioneer of the school if this is the school of the Salaf? If this is the belief of the earliest generation, why is it attributed to him? What's attributed to him is that he said this is the position we should take, and this is the way we should say it, this is how we should say it, and we shouldn't say anything beyond that. And he popularized this way of responding to questions. The reality of the situation is these questions were not very common in the early generation or the earliest of Muslims. The question didn't exist in the first place. And if it arose, people didn't really give it prominence. Later on, during Imam Ahmad's time, maybe a little bit before that, the question became something that people started discussing on a regular basis. So his reaction to the discussion was, stop discussing. That was his reaction. That's different from the early generation of Muslims because there was no discussion in the first place. Understand? So that's the difference between the two. Alright, so he mentioned in many of his books, he says that Allah descends to the heavens of this world, He sees, He places His foot, etc. Alright, so somebody asked him that question, is that, explain to me all these hadith, how do you understand them? So Abu Abdullah, one of the other scholars, he said, we accept them, we believe in them, without trying to figure out how. So this is one of the key terms that was phrased and Phrased by other scholars like Imam Malik, but he really took it to another level. He said, stop asking how. The moment you ask how, you've made a mistake already. You say, well, how can Allah? Don't ask the word how. Just believe and move on. Okay, so you don't ask the details about how. As long as it's authentically transmitted, you believe in it. If it's not authentic, don't believe in it. Okay, so he says, we do not reject the statements of Allah. So we do not reject the statement of Allah, nor do we attribute to Allah anything which He has not attributed to Himself, because there's nothing like Him. So their position is a number of things. First, they're saying, don't ask how. Number two, they're saying, believe in the words and believe in the verse. And number three, do not ever think that any of these words resemble creation in any way, shape, or form, because they don't. Because they don't. Now, if you say, well, how can it not resemble the creation when it's, and you say, didn't I just tell you not to use the word how? And you did. So you need to stop using the word how. Don't ascribe Allah as being like creation. Believe in the words. Understand his position? Okay, this is his position. Alright? And there's a lot other things here. So we pretty much got the point, hopefully. So Imam al-Banna says this regarding this position. He says, safety in religion lies in not crossing your limits. You don't cross your limits when you're trying to understand Islam. And one of the principles of this religion is to accept what is correct and to reject what is wrong. Right? So whatever is easy to understand, whatever is easy for people's hearts to accept, whatever is mentioned in the Quran and mentioned in the Sunnah, and whatever has been passed on by the Muslim community should not make you scared to mention it. You should not be afraid to mention any of these verses in front of someone because they're going to get confused. You don't need to be afraid because someone else is going to say, well, how, this and that. I say, well, we don't get into the how. So you should not be afraid to mention anything like this because Allah attributed these words to Himself. And He was not afraid, so why should you be afraid? Clear? Okay. So don't go out of your way to try and find some attribute for Allah that's not mentioned in the Quran or in the sayings of the Prophet. So what he's saying is people who went and tried to interpret this too much, they try to come up with a new attribute for Allah. So he says, don't try to grasp the knowledge of Allah with your intellect in detail, and do not try to describe Allah with your own tongue, through your own explanations. Whatever Allah explained Himself as, you limit yourself to that and you don't go anything beyond that. So he said, be silent the way that your Lord was silent regarding this. So Allah didn't give you the explanation in detail, you shouldn't give an explanation in detail either. If you do, this is the problem, this is the mistake that you're making. And then he says, going out of your way to know what Allah did not mention is like denying what He did mention about Himself. So why did He mention this if He didn't explain it? Why do you try and go and find another interpretation regarding it? So the same way that you despise when His attributes are rejected. If someone rejects the attributes of Allah and says, no, He doesn't hear, He doesn't see, whatever. You don't like that. That's the problem. You should also despise making new attributes for Him. Okay, so this is the argument. Muslims were successful when they followed what is right and rejected what is wrong. They knew what Allah had mentioned in His book and what the Prophet had mentioned, etc., etc. Those who have knowledge do not go beyond their limits and do not ascribe Allah with what He didn't describe Himself. Because Allah mentioned whatever He willed and He avoided mentioning whatever He willed. And then he quotes a verse of the verse here. If anyone opposes the messenger after guidance has been made clear to him and follows a path other than that of the believers, we shall leave him on his chosen path and we shall burn him in hell, an evil destination. May Allah grant us wisdom and the company of the righteous. So you can pretty clearly see the position that Imam al-Banna is leaning towards. We see that? Pretty clear, right? Okay. But he's actually a pretty objective person. So now he's going to go and explain the second position, and not to bash it down, but he's going to explain to a second position and see what you think. The position of the Khalaf. So the position of the later generation of scholars, and to be honest, it's not only the Khalaf. There are other scholars even among the earliest people who held such views. Okay? But the issue wasn't around, so they didn't discuss it so much. So it's been explained that the Salaf believed in the verses and traditions without trying to figure out the intended meaning. So we're not trying to figure out exactly what it means, but at the same time, they made sure to avoid any element of anthropomorphism. And you saw that, right? They made that very clear. We do not say, so the Salaf were saying, we say that Allah has a hand and Allah has an eye, but that we don't go into details, and it has nothing to do. The moment you think of something like a hand in your mind, you're wrong. The moment it comes to your mind, okay, you messed up. We told you not to do that. You're not supposed to think about it. And if you say, well, what if I'm thinking about a different type of, no, you're wrong again. You made a mistake. So you don't think about that at all. Now the Khalaf, on the other hand, they said, look, the meanings of the words in these verses and in these ahadith, they should not be taken literally, but they should be understood as metaphors. They should be understood as a metaphor, and there's no harm in understanding this as a metaphor. Right? So for example, when we say the hand of Allah, what is a metaphor? Who can tell me what is the definition of a metaphor? Let me tell you what the definition of a metaphor is. So let's take an example. If I say that Shu'aib is a lion, right? Do you start picturing and start thinking, this guy with like a lion head and his beard sticking out and he's got a tail and everything like that? Do you picture that? No. As a strong person. When I say he's a lion, it's a strong person. But I didn't have to use the word like. Because if I said he's like a lion, it's very clear for you. But if I said he's a lion, and I go and speak to someone who doesn't understand what a metaphor is, they may think, hey man, you're a liar, dude. I saw him. He didn't even have a tail. Right? So this guy lied to me. There's no way. I said, you don't understand that we use in language all the time metaphors, right? And we don't have to put the word like in there, because when you put the word like, it turns into a what? Simile. And if you remove the like, it's a metaphor. That's what it is. So we use metaphors every day. We use the word hand in metaphors. We say, you know what? When 9/11 happened, what's the first thing that people said? Who had a hand in it? Which country? Israel. Israel had a hand in it. So do you imagine that, this area called Israel had like this hand reaching out and like somehow had something to do with it? No, you don't, right? So the thing is, we use this as an analogy. If somebody else comes and says, this guy's an ocean. He's an ocean. He's an ocean? He's composed of water? No. What does an ocean mean? He's an ocean. What would it mean? Huh? Vast. Yeah, but with respect to what? Knowledgeable, right? It's a traditional. It's knowledgeable. What other modern metaphors do we use today? Very common ones. Bottom of my heart. Okay. I'm saying this from the bottom of my heart. What else? Someone is cool. Right? That's technically, that's a metaphor. Yeah. What else? He's a beast, right? That's very common. He's a beast. So what do you think? X-Men? He's blue? No. He's what does that mean? He's awesome, or he's powerful, or something like that, right? We use metaphors all the time. So what this group of scholars is saying is, what's the problem with using a metaphor? There's no harm, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was probably trying to mean these things as metaphors in the first place, and we use metaphors all the time. So they said, there's no harm in that. The word face meant, so when he says the face of Allah, right, what was that referring to? Referring to the essence of Allah, referring to Allah Himself. That's just a way to describe Allah Himself. When they use hand, the hand was referring to ability, or the hand was referring to power, or something along those lines. So one of the reasons why they emphasize this is to protect people from anthropomorphism, to protect them from falling into anthropomorphism. So let's take a look at some scholars. Ibn al-Jawzi, a very important scholar, and the interesting with Ibn al-Jawzi is he's a Hanbali scholar, which means that he went away from the position of the school that he ascribes to of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal on this issue. Right? So he wrote a book called Repelling the Idea of Anthropomorphism. So he said, look, Allah says in the Quran, all that remains is the face of your Lord. Okay, on the Day of Judgment, when everything is going to be destroyed, the only thing that remains is the face of your Lord. He said all the scholars of tafsir, of exegesis, when they were understanding the Quran, all of them across the board understood it as meaning all that remains is your Lord. That's it. Otherwise, if you felt that the face somehow is separate from everything else, then that means everything would be destroyed except the face of Allah. I mean, the hand of Allah would be destroyed, the foot of Allah would be destroyed. How can that be? Now, what would the response be of the first group? Does anyone know? That seems like a strong argument, right? Now, what would the first group respond with? Yeah, they'll say, don't worry about it, but there's a little bit more detail they would give. They say, the moment you started referring to the face as a part, you already messed up. And that's where your problem is. Who said that the face is a part? We said it's an attribute. We didn't say it's a part, or it's a section, or it's a whatever it is. The moment you did that, you're the one who started comparing Allah with creation. Because the face is a part in things of creation. But we didn't give an explanation to the word. So you messed up by going and understanding it in this way. That's your fault. You understand? So we have two opinions here. They also said that regarding there are many times, people use it all the time, you do this seeking the face of Allah. Many statements of the Prophet, peace upon him, says, go and give some charity seeking the face of Allah. So what does that mean? He said, this means seeking Him, meaning you're seeking Allah's pleasure or you're seeking Him. Another group of scholars, they said that this verse, everything will perish except His face, meaning accept Him. Okay? So this is Ibn al-Jawzi's opinion up until now. So then he wrote another book, another chapter in his book, and he says that when people make the claim that the Salaf, or the early generation of Muslims, that they took the verses and the hadith literally, he says, I don't agree with that. That association of them having this opinion that you're attributing to them is completely false in my opinion. So Ibn al-Jawzi, he gives an explanation, and he says that, so he gives us, Imam Banna gives a summary. He says, whoever took it literally has committed anthropomorphism. Anyone who says we accept this word according to its linguistic meaning has committed anthropomorphism, because the literal meaning of every word was what it originally intended to be. So that's what literal means. What is the definition of literal? Literal means that you're taking the word as it was originally understood according to its linguistic meaning. And he says, anyone who says, yes, I've taken that, has committed and fallen into a type of anthropomorphism. So he's hitting back hard. So you understand, the issue here. So he's saying that a hand could have no other meaning than a body part. So if you say that the word hand, okay, I know I'm losing some people, just follow up here. If you say that the word hand is to be taken literally, what you've just done, by using the word literally, what you've done is you've given it this meaning of a body part. Because the word hand, according to its literal meaning, has no other meaning besides body part. That's his response to the response that the other group would have given that I just mentioned to you. Following? Okay. Hopefully we're going to take a few more examples, okay? So what he's saying is, the Salaf, they did not take things literally. So this is what Ibn al-Jawzi is saying. That group that you said, they took it literally, but then they said, but Allah is not disassociated from creation. That's not true. They did not take it literally. What they did was, they didn't talk about it. So you guys misunderstood and you said, because they didn't talk about it, they're accepting the literal meaning. He said, no, there's a world of difference between saying we take it literally, but then we don't talk about it, and saying we just don't talk about it. There's a world of difference. So what he's actually saying is that the early generation of Muslims, they didn't respond. So if somebody came up and asked you, has anyone ever been asked a question on any of these things before in their life? There are groups of people who go around interrogating other Muslims to see what their real beliefs are on this, to see which group they belong to. Anyone ever gotten an interrogation? Few people, okay? Few people. Huh? No. Outside of children. Yeah, from children I completely understand. Not from children though. Outside of children. From adults. From adults. Few people have had it, okay? I get it like everywhere I go, okay? It's very, very common. So it's just the way it is. So the thing is, the moment you engage and you try to give an answer, what Ibn al-Jawzi is saying, you've just left the position of the Salaf. You understand? Somebody comes and tests you and asks the question. You know, if you really want to be in the group of the early Muslims, you know what you should do? You say, psh, you walk away. That's what the early Muslims used to do. They didn't used to give detailed answers. And instead, you know what? Why are you asking? This is a ridiculous question. There's no point in asking this. Get out of here. That's the position of the early Muslims. The position of the other group, the Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal's group was, look, you know, you're gonna ask this question to go and cause some problems. I'm gonna tell you how you're supposed to answer this question. Don't try to understand how. Right? So he answered the question by saying, let's stay vague. But Ibn al-Jawzi is saying, you've already left the position of the early Muslims because they never answered the question. Now you've answered the question, you've started your own school of thought. And this school of thought is known as the Athari school. Okay, it's known as the Athari school. So technically it's not known as the Salafi school, it's actually known as the Athari school. Okay, Athar means text, something that has reached us, either a verse of the Quran or a statement of the prophetic report. It's a text. So the Athari means people who stick with the text. Okay? And the other groups, I'll tell you who the other two groups are later. So far we have three groups now. We have three. The actual early Muslims who said nothing. Then we have the ones who said don't say anything, but they're saying something. The Atharis. And then we have the Khalaf group. Okay? So technically we have three groups. Huh? No. Khalaf means after. After Athar, yeah. Or concurrently, almost, but technically the founders of this school are known to be coming after Imam Ahmad. So that's why they're considered to be a little bit after. Well, out of the four opinions, two of them are batil, so we threw them out. Yeah, they're out. Salaf and Khalaf, but then I just threw in the third one, and that is the real Salaf. So the real Salaf had no opinion because they didn't answer the question. They just walked away and just left you. Like Umar. People would come to Umar and say, ask him like a question like this, and his response was, he just took out his stick and he smacked the guy. And that was his response. That's a very powerful response, actually. It's a very strong argument. Right? That's one of the ways to win your argument, actually. So Fakhruddin al-Razi, one of the other very important scholars, he wrote in his book, the text of the Quran should not be understood literally for a number of reasons. So he's saying don't understand the Quran literally, especially on these issues. The first proof of that is take a look at what the literal meaning of this verse would imply. This is referring to Prophet Musa. You should be reared under my watchful eye. Now the word is on. It represents the word on. That would mean that Moses, Prophet Musa, if you took it totally literally, it means that Prophet Musa is actually resting on that eye and stuck to that eye. And he says, what is that supposed to mean? That doesn't mean anything. The second verse he says about Prophet Nuh, he says, build the ark with our watchful eyes. So the linguistic meaning, if you took it literally the way that linguists would understand it without using it metaphorically, it means use the eye as a tool for constructing the ship. He says you can't take something to that level of literalism. And then he says the third is to attribute more than two eyes to one face is something unnatural, which probably there's some problematics with that statement. This is why it's necessary to interpret metaphorically with eye, having the meaning of care and supervision. So what does it mean when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, build the ark under our watchful eyes? This means that, don't worry, you build the ship and we're taking care of you. We're going to make sure everything's going to be fine. Now, the interesting thing, the thing to remember is, what do the Salaf, or what do the Atharis say about the meaning of the verse? They say the exact same thing. They say the meaning of the verse is the same. So this is the key point to remember. The Athari is saying the meaning of the verse is the same. The Khalaf are saying the meaning of the verse, they're completely in agreement here right now. Only difference is, when you zoom into the word, does this word mean this or does it mean that? In the end of the day, no matter what you say, the verse as a whole means the same thing. Okay, so we're going to come back to that a little bit. Imam Ghazali has some very interesting observations about linguistic, okay, we're losing reception here, about taking things literally and linguistic interpretation of the Quran. So in his book, a very important book, Ihya Ulumuddin, when he's using and he's saying when not to use metaphors. So he says the third type is when you mention something directly and it's going to be understood and there's no confusion, but it's used symbolically or metaphorically in order to have a stronger effect on the mind of the listener. So he's saying metaphors and symbolism is designed for it to have a stronger effect on your mind. And he's going to give some very good examples here. He says, for example, the statement of the Prophet, peace be upon him. There's a statement of the Prophet which says, the masjid contracts from phlegm the way that skin contracts from fire. So what does that mean? There's a hadith which says that if someone is in the masjid and they spit, like they hawk up like a lugi and hawk up phlegm and they spit down on the floor, remember at that time the masjid was dirt in the initial stages. So if someone were to spit and they put phlegm there, said the masjid contracts, becomes smaller, the same way that your skin would contract if it's burned. What happens when your skin gets burned? You've seen burned skin before, right? So he says that's what happens to the masjid. This is the statement of the Prophet. So now what is Imam Ghazali saying? It is clear that the open space of the masjid does not actually become smaller because somebody spit. It doesn't mean that the masjid is fitting less people now. So if you go and see someone spit and another person spits, all of a sudden the capacity of the room does not get smaller. Right? So you don't take that as being literal. So he says, let's take another statement of the Prophet. He said, doesn't the person who raises his head before the imam in prayer fear that Allah would turn his head into the head of a donkey? This is a statement of the Prophet. So if you beat the imam, raising the head referring to like you're in bowing position or you're in prostration, before the imam comes up and says Allahu Akbar, you beat the imam. And some of you may do this sometimes, some of you may see other people doing this sometimes. And if you see other people doing this sometimes, what should you be doing? When you're in prayer and you see somebody next to you doing that, what should you be doing? You should be focusing on your own prayer. Why are you looking at the people next to you? Why are you looking at them? Focus on your own prayer first. If you see them outside of your prayer doing it, then it's something else. Right? So you can give them a warning. But now it says, doesn't this person fear that his head will be turned into the head of a donkey? So then Imam Ghazali says, let's talk about the change of appearance. This is something that's never happened. It's never been reported ever in the history of the world that anyone's head ever turned into the head of a donkey. But we know that people throughout history have been spitting in the masjid. There have been people who've done it, but no one's head ever turned into the head of a donkey. So he said, what does that mean? So it means that we can never take something like this literally. We shouldn't have taken it literally in the first place. So he says this is a metaphorical change in meaning. And the reason is because the head of the donkey refers to stupidity or idiocy. And he said that's what you're doing when you're doing something like this. When you're beating the imam, you're doing something really wrong. So that's foolish of you. So he says this is the intended meaning for the person who lifted his head before the imam in prayer. So he's talking about the importance of metaphors. He says it is known that the meaning of an expression can be taken metaphorically either on rational grounds or textual grounds. So there's two reasons or ways for which you might take something to be a metaphor. As for rational grounds, when something is impossible for it to be taken literally, that's when we're talking about rational grounds. So he gives one last example. The Prophet, peace be upon him, said, the heart of a believer is between the two fingers of the merciful. The merciful referring to Allah. So the heart of a believer is between the two fingers of Allah. So he says, you can never take this literally. If you examine the bodies of the believers, you open them up after they die and everything, you're not going to find any fingers there. You're not going to find anything like that. So fingers metaphorically refer to power because it has a more of an impact when wording like this is used rather than really technical linguistic wording. It wouldn't give the same type of power. So this is what Imam Ghazali is saying. So we see the two opinions, right? So Imam Banna says, now it should be clear what these two positions are. Okay, these two approaches have been the subject of major controversy between Muslim scholars. And every group has its own arguments, every group has its own evidence. And then he says this, usually everyone stops here. And this is what I love about this article. Then Imam al-Banna says, if someone were to investigate the issue in detail, they would realize that the distance between these two groups is greatly exaggerated. The reality is that this issue, despite all the ink that people have spilled over and written books, volumes and volumes on just this topic, you're going to end up with one conclusion, that in reality, everything should be left up to Allah, whichever group is going to be right, but they're actually a lot closer to each other than they think. So how can we reconcile between them? So he's going to mention a few points. So we have this understanding. So he says the attributes of Allah, the Salaf or this Athari group says, attributes of Allah are understood without interpreting them and without taking them metaphorically. The other group, the Khalaf, the later generation, they say, interpret them according to what is suitable and what makes the most sense in order to prevent any misunderstanding that someone may have regarding Allah or regarding Allah resembling His creation. Okay? So it is clear that the dispute is here, etc., etc. You can summarize in a few points, 3 points. Number one, both parties, both groups agree that Allah should not be compared with His creation at all. Right? So that's number one. Was there any group that said that you can compare Allah to the creation? Which group? Tashbih, anthropomorphists. So the anthropomorphists compare Allah with the creation. These two groups do not compare Allah with the creation, number one. Number two, each group agrees that the words that are used in these texts that refer to Allah should not be taken literally the way that they're normally taken when we talk about referring them to created beings. So that's agreed upon. And this is built upon their agreement that Allah is not comparable to creation. So number one, Allah should not be compared with creation. Number two, these words do not imply any type of resemblance to creation. So they're agreed. And number three, both groups agree that words are linguistically used to express either feelings in the heart or perceptions in the world. No matter how vast a language may be, it cannot contain that which is unknown to its users. The true essence of Allah falls outside the realm of what can be known. Therefore, it is impossible to try to grasp His essence with mere human words. Meaning, the essence of Allah, trying to really understand in detail what is Allah, you can never figure it out. So whatever words we use for Allah, both sides agree that those words will be limited and you're never going to encompass or fully understand what Allah is exactly. And they're both agreed on this point. And he says this is where the main, the important parts, which we've already discussed in previous classes, this is what needs to be there, and they're there in both groups. So there's no need to make a huge deal out of it. Okay? So he says they both agreed on the principle of interpretation. The only difference is that the Khalaf, they tried to explain the meaning in more detail to prevent the masses of general Muslim community from falling into anthropomorphism or anthropomorphic beliefs, right? So he says this type of difference does not deserve to be so controversial as it is today. Okay. So then he gives his own opinion. He says his opinion is the methodology of the Salaf in being silent and leaving the intended meanings to Allah is preferable. Why does he say it's preferable? It avoids some of the extremer metaphorical interpretations which nullify the attributes of God. So if you think about that now, like the brother mentioned, very good reminder. this group, the Atharis, were so worried that there were too many groups going and taking everything as a metaphor in the Quran. And they were just going off with metaphors. So some people said, you know what, when Allah says to Prophet Musa, throw your staff down. He said, well, the staff referred to Musa's anger. And when he said throw it down, it means throw down your anger, meaning don't get angry. What's the whole point of the story? The whole point of the story is nullified because you just took everything as this was a metaphor for this was a metaphor for this. Adam was a metaphor, he wasn't really a human being, he really didn't live. This other person was a metaphor, this group was a metaphor. If everything is a metaphor, you're left with nothing. And you find many other religions today, they have no issues with metaphors. Almost everything is a metaphor across the board. I teach a class in a university, a Christian university, and that's generally the mentality of almost all of the scholars over there. This is a metaphor, this is a metaphor, this is just a parable. It's not. We don't really mean that. We don't believe that it really happened. That's what's happened to their book. So the thing is, we have to understand that they were afraid of people taking metaphors too far. And the other group was afraid of people falling into anthropomorphism and taking it too far. So each group is kind of a reaction and trying to be on the safe side. So what Imam al-Banna is saying, he says, I prefer the Salaf, or I prefer this Athari opinion because I see that there's more of a danger for people to go and jump in and make everything a metaphor and you're left with nothing else in your religion. Now the opposite side would say, I feel that it's safer to take these as metaphors because you're going to have too many people start falling into anthropomorphism. So it really depends at the end of the day, which one there's really a more danger for, if you were to give some type of preference. So then he says, Islam is comprehensive enough of a religion to accommodate both parties. Even the strictest of people who had the position of the Atharis, sometimes they also resorted to metaphorical interpretations. So Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal is known as the founder and like the man on the Athari school. And he says even he metaphorically explained two statements of the Prophet. One of them is that the black stone that's built into the Kaaba, in the side of the Kaaba building, the black stone is the hand of Allah on earth. And he said, you don't take this literally. You have to explain this as a metaphor. Because how can the black stone be the hand of Allah? He says, in this case, this one, you take it metaphorically. Another one is that the heart of a believer is between the two fingers of the merciful. He said, this one, you have to take metaphorically as well. Imam Ghazali already mentioned this. And there's a third one. He said that the other prophetic statement, I feel the breath of the merciful coming from the direction of Yemen, which is to the south, right, of Makkah and Medina. So I feel that, so this is a statement, we're not going to get into the details. He said he took that one metaphorically as well. So three important statements which resemble this discussion. Even Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal said we have to go with metaphors on something like this because this is something you don't leave. This is just too out there. So you have to draw your line. So then Imam al-Banna came up with some very interesting thing. He said, Imam Nawawi, very famous scholar, who's part of the Khalaf group actually, he says he tried to narrow down the distance. So there's been a lot of scholars in the past who either argue one way or the other and they're very staunch about it. Like Ibn al-Jawzi, for example. You can tell he wrote a whole book about, repelling anthropomorphism, and he's very stern about his views, and he's a great scholar. Imam Nawawi is one of the scholars who's trying to just soften things up and say, let's not be so polemical. Let's try and unite together. Let's try and get all the groups together. So he has an opinion where he's trying to say that we should bring everyone together. But Imam al-Banna he did not quote that statement of Imam Nawawi. He just says this is one of the few scholars that I could find in history that had one of those things. So there's a precedent for what I'm writing. That's what he's saying. And he probably would have found it if he was not killed. But I'm sure someone else has already written a commentary. I have not come across it. Al-Razi, the same one we already talked about, he said to balance things out, when we allow metaphorical interpretation, we do not allow people to go into too much detail. In the instances where we do allow it, we make sure that we leave, in the instances where we don't allow you to have a metaphor, we also leave the understanding of that to Allah. So he says sometimes we will take the opposite position on certain things. This is the general rule, and it should be followed when interpreting all ambiguous statements. And our success lies with Allah. So, and then I'll conclude with this last thing. So Imam Banna at the end, he says, the difference between them was limited to explaining the meaning of certain words which were allowed to be explained. So this is a petty issue in the end of the day. And in fact, some of the other people resorted to metaphorical interpretation themselves. The most important things that Muslims should now be focusing on is to unify their ranks, and Allah is sufficient for us and is the best protector. So we really need to get beyond this issue. If you see it being made into some huge issue, understand, number one, why it's being made into an issue. Yes, it can potentially be a major issue. But if people are within this circle of these two schools that we just talked about, and they have a clear understanding of that, then it should not be made an issue within this circle. The issue is, the real issue, the real danger lies outside on the two extreme opinions that we were talking about. So no one should confuse people who are in this circle as being one of the extremist groups. And no one should think that one of the extremist groups here is actually inside the circle as well. So there really has to be a proper balance and understanding of this issue, because it's dividing, unfortunately, in America, in the West, it's dividing Muslims along leadership lines. So there are some leaders in the community who identify with this group, and there are some leaders in the community who identify with this group, and the followers of this person do not even want to attend the lectures of this other guy. And they don't want to attend the lectures of even their students. So this is really, we don't need, it's not just about practicality and let's focus on politics or focus on something else. There's no need to have such a huge debate on this issue, which is actually petty at the end of the day. But some people they make it seem like it's a bigger thing. If someone is in one of these extremes, it's a bigger thing. But the vast majority of mainstream Muslim scholars in America and in the West are usually not at one of these extremes. They're usually within one of these two positions. So hopefully that explains a little bit more about our position. It explains more about, has anyone actually read the methodology page on the CIS website where it says methodology? No one has read methodology. Now, okay, one or two people. Now go to our website and read why I spent so much time writing what the methodology of this school is. And now hopefully you'll understand it a little bit better. Okay, and that's the point, is to actually unite the Muslim community here, because we don't need to be divided along these lines. There are other things we need to be divided on, but this is not one of them. Okay, so questions on this? Yeah, there are several ayahs, but I think nobody differs that Muslims need to be united. So we don't even need to put proof out there. I think everyone is clear about uniting, inshallah. So I hope so. Anyone feel that we should be more divided? No, okay. So inshallah, hopefully everyone's clear.
I think that we should emphasize on it more.
Yeah. No, alhamdulillah. Yeah, we should emphasize, but to be honest, if we talk about unity and you don't understand this, it has no meaning. Because then someone will come along and say, yes, let's be united, and we'll be united with everyone. Let's be united with Christians in their beliefs, and let's be united with transgender people in their beliefs, and let's be united with this group in their beliefs. And it sounds so good. You can't unite with everyone on everything, right? So you have to identify what it is that we want to unite on. Otherwise, it just becomes just fluff. It just becomes a bunch of talk. So we want to make sure that you understand deeper what it is we're uniting and why we're uniting and on what we're uniting. These are the very important things. No, it depends which group. So the thing is, if a Christian comes and says, hey, let's unite. Okay, we're willing to unite, but unite on what? If you're saying, let's unite together and feed the poor people. Okay, great, let's unite. If they say, well, let's unite and say we all believe in one God and we all worship God the same way. But we don't. So we cannot unite on that. right? So we have to define, when we say unity, we have to define what is it that we're uniting on, right? On what point, and what is the purpose of this unity we're talking about? Unity is restricted. So on this point, we have to unite on the three principles that he mentioned that unite the two opinions together. And not divide on the fact that one group says, don't ask how, and the other one explains a how through a metaphor. There's no need to divide on that. So we made it very clear. On this one, we should be united on the principles, on the 3 points. Hopefully that's clear, inshallah. Yes. Which group am I in? I'm in the unity group. Yeah, I'm in the unity. I'm at the end. Alhamdulillah. It's not that they didn't ponder. There were some very intelligent people. They chose to say, don't ask the question. No, they didn't walk away, but they said, you should not answer this question, because the moment you start answering, you start falling into contradictions, and you start thinking the wrong way, and you shouldn't be thinking that way. This becomes the biggest issue. This also represents generally their approach to Islamic law. Okay, so their approach to Islamic law kind of resembles this more. When Allah says something is forbidden, unless He's clearly specified the details and understanding, or when the Prophet says something, you take it generally more literally. You remember, you were in Islamic Law 1 class, right? Remember we talked about the hadith where the two groups prayed Asr prayer differently, right? And then we said the 4 schools fall within certain categories. And the categories that they fall in, we said the Hanafi and the Maliki school falls more on this side, and we said the Shafi and the Hanbali school fall more on this side. Right? So that's why the Hanbali school is generally on that other side. Kind of to do with their way of understanding things. The problem with Khawarij is not that they're literal. The problem with Khawarij is that they kill people. That's their problem. If they just took things literally only, and that was their main issue, then they would not have been such a big problem in Islamic history. Killing people for their point. Yeah, so if the Hanbali, like Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, right? Okay, he didn't agree with the other people's opinion. He's not going around saying, okay, now my followers, go and kill them. Didn't say that. So that's what makes him, a lot more moderate. So just so you know that the Khalaf, by the way, so yeah, I didn't explain this point. The Khalaf consists of 2 schools of thought. One school of thought is known as the Ash'ari school of thought, and the second is the Maturidi school of thought. Ash'ari and Maturidi. Maturidi. And for people who know Arabic, don't misunderstand what Maturidi means. Because Maturid means what you want. So this is not the what you want school. You just do whatever you want. There's a place called Maturid, and he was from the place called Maturid. Okay, so the Maturidi school. Now, the last thing, this is very important, so I hope you get this when you walk out. So, the Athari school, the Ash'ari school, and the Maturidi school, as a group, as a whole, they comprise what is known as the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. There's people of the Sunnah and the community of Muslims. Okay, so they all 3 comprise this. And what's happened is some people who are a little bit extra hardcore, from either side, they threw one group out of this circle. So some Atharis threw the other 2 groups out, and sometimes people from the other 2 groups, they threw the Atharis out. And they say, no, we're Ahlul Sunnah only, you're not. So we need to just keep this circle intact. And then there are other groups, which we'll talk about next week, who have different opinions, who generally fall outside of the circle. Now, if you fall outside of the circle, does it mean you're not a Muslim? No. Doesn't mean that you're not a Muslim. Right? These people who are not in the circle doesn't mean that they've left Islam. It means that they have some interpretation or some understanding which is we consider to be erroneous and is problematic, and that's something that needs to be discussed or debated or fixed. So there's difference. Okay, so hopefully that clarifies a little bit more. Okay, see that's part of the problem. So this group on Brookhurst. In this masjid, they call themselves Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. They're known as the Habashi group, right? They're among the people who fall in their theology, they identify as Ash'aris. Ash'aris who take Atharis and literally throw them out of the fold. They say these guys are just way off. All right, and they literally take some of their scholars and they say that some of the Athari scholars have just left Islam completely. They're not even Muslim. So, yeah, it's a long story what they're following. So, yeah, they go with a different qibla as well. Yeah. So, we will discuss that in our contemporary fiqh issues class on how to determine what the real qibla, the direction of prayer is, inshallah. Sufism is just basically people who focus more on spirituality, and then they have some other things on how they focus on spirituality. There are contradictions in language or contradictions in trying to understand reconciling between two things, and the problem has to do with language. We do that all the time. Every day we run into contradictions, but we reconcile them because they're not real contradictions, they're apparent contradictions, because that's the way human language is, right? So the thing is, when you explain to people what a real contradiction is and what an apparent contradiction is, you say there's no real contradictions in Islam at all. When you say apparent contradictions, everyone contradicts themselves in what they're saying almost every single day. But they reconcile it because it just has to do with language. It's never, we're not computers, so we don't make closed statements. We make very open statements. And if you make another statement that's also open, and you look at the two together, and you assume that they're closed, they look like they're contradicting, but they're not. We do it all the time. That's when the Quran, sometimes when people go so far, then the Quran says deaf, dumb, and blind, they're not going to return back to the path. No, that's the reality of situation. Allah hits them hard. So if they don't want to see, they don't want to see. So there's not too much you can do in that case. Yeah. It is, but there's a big discussion about it. And that's beyond the scope of our class. There's a book, you read Arabic though, right? Read a book by Sheikh Judair, Abdullah al-Judair, regarding this. He wrote a book on just the explanation of this. He's one of my teachers in the UK. He wrote a book on this, really powerful book, very interesting, unique insight. The name of the book, he only has like 10 books. And this is one of his shortest books. So just search for his name, call up Jarir, and he should be able to get you a copy. Okay, so you have Atharis, Ash'aris, Maturidis. Okay, then the other two opinions, the other two extreme opinions. So you have the anthropomorphists, who are known as Mutashabbiha, and then you have the Jahmiya, or the nullifiers, the people who say Allah has no attributes. They're known as Jahmiya. Because of their founder or because of one of their guys who started, his name was Jahm. So this is technically under unseen matters. Yeah, this is known as the ghaib, because it's something that you cannot know through your own about Allah. Yeah. So this is the first part. Next week we'll cover the second part, and there's a 85% chance that next week might be the last class. No, see the thing is, when we talk about groups are defined when you're talking about specific issues. So to give you an example, Ibn al-Jawzi, when we're talking about this issue, he is among the Khalaf. When we're talking about Islamic law, he's a Hanbali. So the thing is, you fall into a group on different issues. There's not one group where you fall into all the issues. Multiple choice would be more like, which things do the Salaf and Khalaf not have in common? Which one of these 5 things do they not have in common? And you're going to get confused because you're going to memorize 3. And you're going to say, but there's 4 and only one of them can be wrong. So how do I figure out what is one? So what's going to happen is, I'm going to see 3 and I'm going to make 3 into 4 by splitting one of them in half. And that's going to confuse you, and you're going to think, I memorized 3, but if you memorize them wording and you don't understand what they mean, you're going to mess up. So you have to understand what the 3 means, so that if I turn 3 into 4, you know all 4 and you know the 5th one is wrong. That's what you need to figure out. So that's going to be like a multiple choice question. I haven't made it yet. So the thing is, this is what I want you to do. I don't want you to memorize, okay, there's 3 here and there's 4 here, and then all of a sudden someone says, oh, actually there's 4 here and there's 5 here. That's not the way I memorized it. I memorized 3 and 4. Then it means you didn't understand it properly. If somebody gives you a different number and you're thrown off completely, we talked about Allah's justice and Allah's mercy. So Allah's justice causes what? So just remember, what does mercy mean? Mercy causes what? The power of Allah does what? Creates things, right? The wisdom of Allah does what? Organizes things, sets their terms. The mercy of Allah does what? Leads to forgiveness. The justice of Allah does what? Leads to punishment. So the focus, when you talk about justice, the focus is, this is what leads to punishment. Right? And the mercy is what leads to punishment? No, it leads to the forgiveness. So that's why we differentiate between the aspects. So when Allah is saying, whenever Allah mentions that He is the just, what is the point He's trying to make? So if, let's say somebody sins, right? Somebody did so many bad sins and they're saying, I can't believe I did this, I can't believe I did this. When you go and you talk to them and you're going to remind them, don't worry. Allah is the most just. Would you do that? You wouldn't do that, right? You would say, no. Allah is the most merciful, right? You wouldn't say, don't forget, Allah is Al-Jabbar and He can punish you as much as you want. That's not the time to use that attribute, right? That's we need to focus on the attribute. What happens? Why is Allah mentioning His attributes? Because something happens through that attribute. That's the point, inshallah. طيب سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نستغفره الله ونتوب إليك. السلام عليكم.